Hi, I'm Tony Williams, and this is Brooklyn Savvy. Hi, I'm Tony Williams, and welcome to Brooklyn Savvy. We are pleased to have Tony Cockerham. You are an executive vice president at Spence, Chapin, and we're going to be talking about transracial adoptions. Now, the reason this is so significant is because if you've been watching Brooklyn Savvy for the last 15 seasons, we talked about this particular, I don't want to say issue, but yeah, the issue back, and it was our third show of the season. So of our first season, and Ellen Salpeter, who is now a panelista with us, shared her story. So we're going to get to Ellen's story and to Rachel Nordlinger. Now, you are an executive at Mercury, but you've got a really fascinating story too to share about your adoption experience. So, and then we have, of course, Denise Arbisu. So, you know what? Why don't we just get started? Talk to us about transracial adoption. When we're speaking about transracial adoption, how frequent is it today? And then what are some of the issues?
It's actually become more frequent.
Really?
In the last 5-6 years, domestically especially, than it ever has been. So I have to qualify my talk by explaining that I work for a private adoption agency. We do domestic adoption and intercountry adoption. My specialty has always been domestic adoption, but I can talk about international as well. International adoption has always been predominated by transracial adoption. Most of the children who needed homes overseas are children of color. And the families who are interested in adopting them and eager to adopt them are white families for the most part, and there are reasons for that.
Now, why is that? Yeah, why is that? Why is that?
Always environmental issues that influence things like this. One of them was the pill.
Ooh, interesting. Yes.
The pill,
Technology.
The pill really had an impact on white births. So they dropped.
Oh, that's what we're dealing with right now. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
They dropped significantly, and there was, you know, it was the 60s and the 70s, and there was less of a stigma about being sexually free, and also about having a so-called illegitimate child.
And what about abortion? You know, the rise of abortion, that it was more acceptable for women. I mean, not that you would talk about it, but that would
absolutely a very important factor. And it was during that period, with the decrease in the number of white births, that you began to see white families much more motivated about adopting internationally. And they went for the international because of the domestic births had gone down.
Right.
So the countries that they flocked to happened to be countries with Asian children, South American children, not African children.
Interesting.
So
however, you adopted an
I
African child. Talk to us about your story.
I mean, for me, one of the reasons we were talking before the show was that there weren't that many countries for a single woman in their 40s to adopt from, and I firmly believed that it needed to be a clean adoption. I wanted to know, if to the extent possible, that my child wasn't sold into adoption or, you know, any
Stolen
of the
from a parent,
exactly.
kidnapped into
So
adoption,
Guatemala
right.
was an option, but there were a lot of questions about where the children came from. Nepal was really hard. China had just changed their laws to make it more stringent, and single women were not necessarily offered what I'll call a healthy child. They were offered children with special needs.
Single women.
Single women.
Oh, wow.
And married, there were some restrictions on a joint age of a married couple. I mean, all to the good of a child. Raising a child, you need to have a certain vitality and economic income and everything else. But so I lived in and still live in Crown Heights. I had always had, you know, a diverse circle of friends and family, and it just felt right. And I had several friends who had also adopted, and we had done some relief work with Ethiopia. And actually, my paternal grandmother, was involved in the Ethiopian airlift of Ethiopian Jews to Israel many years ago, and I had gone with her. So I had a bit of a relationship to Ethiopia as well. So I adopted my daughter.
As you've adopted your daughter, what have been some of the surprises or challenges, you know, when it comes to raising a black girl?
Well, obviously making both of us, but especially my daughter, comfortable that she's not being raised in a completely white world. So choice of school, choice of everything from childcare to extracurricular activities to friendships in my world. Hair is a really big thing for a teenage girl. She's now a teenager.
Yeah, how you,
and,
that's especially with African American women.
and
that's
so,
an issue.
you know,
Right. How to deal with
understanding
it.
that it's not something, and I wish I had a tenth of her hair. So we talk about that and understanding that she needed women in her life like you, Tony, and others that could mentor her in that way or be someone she could call. We also were blessed that the childcare daycare that she went to, a preschool, really early on was very diverse. And in fact, not only were there children of color, many colors, and blended families, there was a family that looked like our family. There was a white mother, a bio older daughter, not a son, and an adopted son from Ethiopia. So it was like
Now, Ellen,
having
I'm sorry,
her feel comfortable.
How old was your daughter when you
She
first
was
adopted
about
her?
3
So
years
how
old.
did she
About
adapt?
3.
I wanted to
Right.
just take a step back.
She was very happy, regardless of the enormous loss in her young life,
right.
And always had a smile. And she loved being around other people and other children. And I think because she had spent almost 2 years in 2 different orphanages, that was her worldview. Was
Wow.
always busy,
Wow.
always kids, although a lot of kids coming and going. And so I think she was really excited to be with other children and extended family. And I only have one other son, and he's older.
Right.
But I wonder, and I'm going to point this to you, Rachel, because we're not in each other's skins. So we
Right.
can, of course, you're doing everything that you can, and you're very intentional around raising your child. What was your experience? Because you grew up in a home where you were adopted by two, and this is going back not a couple,
Yeah, I
20
was
years ago.
adopted in 1970 in New Mexico, Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Wow.
And my parents also adopted another black child, not biologically related to me, my brother Fred. And then they had 2 of their own, so there were 4 of us all together. My parents were active in the 60s, sort of in the civil rights movement. They, loved to tell stories about how they marched. And so they were early sort of liberal multiculturalists, and they thought that it would be a way for society to, sort of heal from what we have been through for centuries of, racism, et cetera. It was a novel idea. They thought that they could raise my brother and I in an environment which they called colorblind.
Is there such a thing?
Yeah.
No.
Say, yeah,
Yeah.
Absolutely
right.
and
There's not.
unequivocally no.
No.
And that's a luxury that as a black child you're not afforded because obviously
Right.
when people see you, they see
Black. Right.
so no, unfortunately, that's really comes from a vantage point of privilege. But long story short, I was given an incredible amount of love, had phenomenal, wanted for nothing. We moved a lot. That's probably my only complaint. We moved every year or 2 in my childhood, from New Mexico to Colorado to Michigan to California, even Holland at one point. Every time we moved, it was to a predominantly white neighborhood.
Yeah.
I didn't know any black people until I went to college.
Wow.
Wow.
So I had a full
How did you adjust to
blown
that?
identity crisis.
Right.
I moved to Africa.
You said full-blown identity crisis. That's
Right.
when you're talking about your identity, meaning you didn't know where you fit. Is that what you mean when you're saying?
I had a double consciousness.
Right.
I had
Right.
always had to be an overachiever because I grew up sort of assimilating.
Right.
So I had no vantage point or cultural identity. And then I really felt a serious sort of sense of loss. And I really became kind of, in my parents' eyes, rebellious because I started to really ask a lot of questions about where I came from and who I am, and they really didn't appreciate it too much.
And didn't you speak about transparent adoptions now? We spoke, when we spoke on the phone, we talked about how birth families are now very much integrated into the lives of
Oh, yes. We call that openness.
I
in
call it
adoption.
transparent.
That's not the nice enough.
So do you mean like the involvement of the
refer back
parents?
to-
Is that what you're saying? The birth
But
parents?
you wanted to go back.
I want to go
and
back
then
to a
hit
point
that, 'cause I wanna hit
that
Right.
Rachel made about white privilege.
Yeah.
And that attitude among many white families during the period that you were adopted was very, very popular, that we're going to solve a social problem. We're going to save the world. And really what you're doing is adopting a child. And you're being very ignorant about the world in which you live. And, you know, as people of color, we have to know about race and racism.
Absolutely.
People, you know, the white privilege, part of the advantage of that is that you don't necessarily have to know about. But if you are going to adopt a child, I love the things that you were saying
Yes.
about
Amazing.
the preparation.
She's
and
really
making
intentional.
Sure that when we work with families who declare to us that they could adopt a child who looks like them, who doesn't look like them, then we proceed to ask a multitude of questions.
Yeah.
Well, what does that mean?
Right.
And where do you live? And who surrounds you in your life?
Right.
And what do you know about race? And what do you know about racism? And when you say a child of color, do you mean an Asian child?
Right.
Do you mean a Latino child? Do you mean a black child? We really, really scrutinize people because the truth of the matter is many people don't stop to consider this. It's very interesting when you think about when you're motivated to do something and you're really driven to do something. And the people I come into contact with are people who are driven to be parents.
Right.
And it comes from a love, a place
love.
of love.
Right. A
But
very
it's
good
really
place.
fraught.
But I
Right.
got to tell you, if you're going to adopt,
Right.
fair, not fair, I don't know, but my responsibility, my responsibility is to the children. We used
Right.
to say at my agency, people would ask, well, who's your client? You work with birth mothers, you
Right.
work with adoptive parents, and you work with children. My responsibility is to the child. So I have to make sure that this is going to be an environment that in which a child can thrive and have good, healthy self-esteem.
It's really, you know, as the parent of a now teenage daughter, I am finding so much out because at 12, 13, 14, you're questioning who you are regardless of parentage.
That's right.
Right.
That's
You're
right.
right.
Who
That's
am
just
I?
the
How do
norm.
I fit? And being in New York City, as opposed to we recently spent a few years in Miami, which obviously is a very diverse in different ways. It's definitely more brown than black.
Right, right.
And within the brown, there's a color-coded caste system. And an economic system, and it was really interesting. And being in New York, just her first day of school, she had a girl who looked like her. They have the same hair, and it was just like, thank you.
The hair, my God.
But beyond the hair, just, you know, who am I, what am I doing, and what do I care about? And really all they care about is YouTube makeup videos for the most part at 13. But really figuring out, and I just remember in her early days, you know, she wasn't colorblind, but every kid was just a kid. And, you know, and then realizing that it was kids who looked like her, who didn't look like her, but she just was so full of joy and life. And now as she's getting older, those questions of really understanding, especially as racism's always been there, anti-Semitism's always been there, but the overt nature and the permission people have been given to say things that are really horrible. And, you know, her school in Miami, we were, you know, someone said after our current president was elected that, you know, once he was in office, she was going to be sent home. But it was really interesting. And so just really making her aware that A, she's loved, but B, she comes from this culture. I mean, one of the things that we did and we're redoing now that we're back is really staying in touch with, there's an Ethiopian adoption group. And I will say that in the agency that I did use, there were many black parents adopting Ethiopian children.
Oh, that's
it was
wonderful.
not just white. There were a lot of white parents adopting multiple children from different countries.
Right.
And then there were a number of black parents. We have friends from DC who we met in Ethiopia who adopted 2 children.
And I wanted to talk about the open adoptions because and oftentimes I can see if there are issues or if there's a transracial adoption, it might be a good thing to have an. So if you could just explain what that is.